Good afternoon, scholars. It should be, I believe, Thursday when you watch this video. Today we'll be doing lesson 32-5 on complex solutions. So go ahead and take a moment to write down the title and the objective for today's lesson. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you paused the video and were able to get down the title and objective. So moving on to discriminant, this is what we did yesterday. I just wanted to remind you about that. When we discussed yesterday, we said that something could have two real solutions, but it could also have something that would be not a real solution. So that's what we're going to discuss today. So yesterday we learned that if the discriminant of a quadratic equation is negative, there's no real solutions, right? So if we end up here with a negative number, if this gives us a negative number, the piece of information that tells us is there are no real solutions. And as we asked yesterday, okay, well, if there's no real solutions, are there like some fake solutions? What does that mean? So we call something a solution that's not real. We call it an imaginary number. So there are no real solutions. If the discriminant of a quadratic equation gives us a negative number, there's no real solutions to that equation, but there are two imaginary number solutions. Now, I know this sounds super weird and dumb. However, I'm going to give you the definition of imaginary numbers. Basically, it's just a symbol that we use when we run into something that looks like this. Have you ever noticed that you cannot take the square root of a negative number? So for instance, if I try to take the square root of -1, if you tried to do that on your calculator, you won't be able to do it. You're going to get an error. You cannot take the square root of a negative number, not just -1, but any number. So we're like, okay, we can't do that, but we still want to indicate that, you know, what if we end up with something that looks like this? What could we use instead? So what we say is that instead of using this right here, if we find ourselves in this situation, we can use this little I in its place, and this I stands for imaginary. Okay, so let's say I is equal to the square root of -1. So we can do a couple examples, and hopefully that will help us understand when we would use something like this and what it looks like. So this will be example A. Okay, so if we are asked to simplify, we'll start out not looking at quadratics, just looking at a more simple problem so that we get comfortable using this little symbol right here. So if we're asked to simplify the square root of -4, if you plug in the square root of 4 on your calculator, what would you get? That's right, it would just be a +2, okay? So the square root of 4, just as a reminder, is +2. Now you may think, okay, well, the square root of -4, maybe that's simply -2, and that's incorrect. Okay, so make sure you're not using that. What I can do here is I can say, all right, this is the same as saying this, the square root of -1 times the square root of 4. Okay, so you see what I've done here is I've taken my square root, which has a -4 inside, and I've basically broken it into two pieces. I said, all right, let's say the square root of -1 times the square root of 4. If we were to multiply these two together, we would get the square root of -4. Okay, but what we're trying to do is here, we're trying to get rid of this whole negative piece so that we can deal with this right here. So we already set up here that I is equal to the square root of -1, and this is the square root of -1 right here. So instead of writing the square root of -1, we're going to go ahead and write I in its place. So now we have I times the square root of 4. Okay, now we've gotten rid of that negative sign and we can continue simplifying. So let me ask you this. What is, well, instead of writing it with the multiplication symbol, I'll just write them right next to each other. Same thing, I times the square root of 4. This line is saying that, and so is this line. And there's one more way that we could finally simplify this. We said earlier that the square root of 4 is simply equal to 2. Here we're taking the square root of 4, so we can write 2. Write I times 2. Now we usually write it numbers before symbols. You see that when we used to do something like 4x, for instance. We usually don't write x times 4 like that, right? So I'm going to go ahead and write the number before the symbol. Okay, so if you kind of look at where I started and where I ended, you can see, and this would be my answer, I've simplified this. Basically what I did is I took the square root of the positive version, right? The positive version of this number in here, which would just be 4. I basically took the square root of that and then tacked an I onto it to kind of indicate that we would have to multiply that by the square root of -1. Okay, I'm going to do, let's see, one more example for you guys. Okay, and this is going to tie back into what we did the rest of the week. So we have been looking at problems such as, oh, sorry, let me move. Here we go. So you've been looking at problems with quadratic equations, right? And now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how do these complex solutions relate to a problem like this. Okay, so if you see something like this, again, we learned about the quadratic formula, so I'm going to go ahead and start using the quadratic formula. And at a certain point, you're going to see that I will need to use my imaginary numbers. Okay, so just pay attention to when that happens. So again, I know how to use the quadratic formula. I'm going to write it down over here in case we forgot. The quadratic formula is x is equal to -b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Okay, so now I just need to figure out what is a, b, and c in this problem. There's no number here, so I'm going to go ahead and I know that will be a 1, that coefficient, so that will be a. -6 will be b, and +12 will be c. Now that I've labeled those, I can go ahead and figure out what x will be equal to. Okay, so -b. b is -6. Okay, so just keep in mind that even though this b is already negative, the formula is still telling us we need to put another negative out in front, so we'll put that there. Okay, plus or minus the square root of b, again, is -6 squared minus 4 times a is 1, and c is +12. Okay, all over 2 times a. Again, this is just what we were working on 2 days ago in Miss Bab's video. So negative minus 6. Okay, so look, 2 negatives will give us a +6. Plus or minus. Now I'm just going to simplify this piece right here. What is -6 squared? This is where people make a lot of errors. They start to do, what they forget to do is put it in the calculator with these parentheses. Okay, so make sure you're doing that. That will give you a +36. Minus, what is 4 times 1 times 12? Just 48. Okay, again, that is all divided by 2 times 1, which is simply 2. Okay, let's keep going. Now we've got 6 plus or minus the square root of, well, what is 36 minus 48? It's -12. Divide by 2. You can probably hear my roommates right now. They're taking out the trash. Okay, so now that we've done this, look what we have here. We have a negative number inside of the square root. We said we can't do that, so what we're going to need to do is use an I here in order to keep simplifying. So let's keep going. But instead of writing this as the square root of -12, I'm going to go ahead and write I times the square root of +12. Okay, again, we have to put this I in here to indicate that this square root of 12 would actually be multiplied by the square root of -1. That all still gets divided by 2. Okay, so there we go. You can continue simplifying. For instance, 6 divided by 2 would be 3, right? And but basically what I wanted to show you is this step right here, okay? Because you may be tempted to say, okay, well, this has no real solutions. And that's true. It has no real solutions, but we could still say that x is going to be equal to 6 plus or minus I times the square root of 12 divided by 2. The other way that you could write this is x is equal to 6 plus I times the square root of 12 over 2. And x could also be equal to 6 minus I times the square root of 12 over 2. That's because we said this plus or minus. So we have 2 scenarios. We could either have a plus there or a minus there. Okay? So these would both be called imaginary solutions. just don't forget, basically whenever you see this negative right here, we need to write an I and then take the square root of the positive. Hopefully that makes sense. If you have questions, please let me know. Have a great day.